Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We will go ahead and get started shortly. We'll give a few more minutes for people to join us. Okay, perfect. With the sake of time, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today this afternoon. We will be joined by the attorneys from Immigrant Legal Resource Center as we can share some informational webinar about traveling while undocumented. So thank you all for joining us. I will go ahead and go to the next slide. And then this webinar is being recorded. We do have live captioning or closed captioning available for this informational webinar. If you can go ahead and see the icon show captions, you can go ahead and select that and that will be available to you. Also, please utilize the Q&A icon to ask any questions you may have as the chat is not available, but we will be dropping some links and resources in the chat as well. And then I will go ahead and pass it on to Veronica.
Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Like Cynthia mentioned, today we will be discussing the rights individuals have or how it is to travel as a non-citizen. I do want to add that while we will be sharing information on what someone could do or how someone could prepare to understand what it is to travel if you don't have status, we're going to also generally speak about what it is to travel as someone who is not a US citizen, right? So we'll have a bit of information around traveling both domestically and abroad as someone who might have an advance parole travel document or someone who is a lawful permanent resident, and give information about that and how interactions could look. Today, I am joined by my two amazing colleagues, Mio and Carolina, both attorneys at the ILRC. My name is Veronica, also an attorney at ILRC, and we will be presenting your information. On the screen today is the agenda of what we plan to cover. So we'll start with doing some updates on domestic travel, information on what documentation might be needed as you're traveling here within the United States or to a US territory. We'll follow that by going over some rights to travel of a person with advance parole or who is a lawful permanent resident or other types of temporary statuses. And then we'll spend the majority of today's webinar discussing how someone could deal with or how an interaction with law enforcement at an airport could go. We know that there's a lot of questions around what could be asked of you as you're either re-entering the United States or as you're traveling domestically, what could be asked of you by a TSA agent or an ICE agent or a CBP agent, right, if you're entering the country. So we'll spend a lot of time going through that. So to get us started, I will start first by going over some domestic travel updates. And then just to start off, a big question that we get a lot is, can you travel domestically if you do not have status, right? So if you are someone who doesn't have, deferred action for childhood arrival, right? And you don't have a work permit, you don't have TPS, or maybe you do have that, and you're thinking of traveling domestically, what are your rights? What can you do? Where can you travel, right? Maybe you don't have any sort of temporary status and you're thinking about traveling and boarding a plane. You're wondering what the risks could be for that or what has changed, right? So to answer the question simply, right, if someone doesn't have status, we're talking about someone who might not have some sort of temporary protection like DACA or TPS, or someone who doesn't have a green card, right? Are you able to travel? The short answer is yes, right? You could travel. There are different documents that you could use to travel and board a plane or a bus or a train here in the United States. But you have to consider the risks, right? And the risks, or what could potentially be a risk, will change depending on what status you have or don't have, or how long you have that status for. So it's definitely important to consider what risks are associated with that. Also consider where you are traveling to, right? Where you might be landing or where you might be boarding the plane. Also will be important in the calculus of what the risk is. And then also thinking about what identification you could provide or will be asked to provide, right? And we'll go into that a bit more throughout this webinar, right? But if you are flying, right, and boarding a domestic flight or even an international flight, you will be asked to present some form of identification with the passage of the Real ID. And its implementation starting May 7th of this year, right? People will be asked to present a Real ID document or a document that complies with the Real ID, like a passport, a Real ID, a work permit, right? And so when we're thinking about traveling and the risks, also thinking about what document you can produce and what information that document has about you, right? And then also, like I mentioned, considering, if you are at an airport or traveling by bus or plane, what are the points of contact with immigration authorities or other type law enforcement officials? And also thinking about if you are traveling to a location that's 100 miles from the border, also considering how that shifts, what kind of questions you might get, right, at an airport, right, or at a land location, what kind of questions you might get and what questions are permitted because you are within that 100 miles from the border. So things to keep in mind as we're discussing traveling domestically here or traveling abroad. So the biggest change we have seen recently around documentation was that the Real ID finally went into effect, right? So this has been, the law was passed back in 2005. There was pushbacks to actually implementing it nationwide to give states more time to comply or be able to comply with Real ID established security standards. And it had been pushed back now for 20 years or over 20 years, right? There was an amendment or an alteration to the law back in 2020, right, to account for electronic IDs, right, if that was being given. But it hadn't been implemented until now, right? So it went into effect on May 7th. And essentially what it does is that the law establishes the minimum security standard for state driver's licenses and identification cards. And these are state driver's licenses and identification cards that will be used to enter certain federal buildings, right? So if you are entering a federal building, this will be the type of ID that is accepted, right? To now, or before this went into effect, right? If you had a driver's license or a state ID that didn't comply with federal standards, right, you would still be able to use it to board a plane or get into a federal building. But as of May 7th, you cannot. So you would need a Real ID or a document that complies with the Real ID to enter certain federal buildings, to board commercial airplanes, right? So flights. I think it's the biggest question that people have, right? How do I board a plane if I don't have a Real ID? Or to enter nuclear power plants, which is less common, right? So so that's where they will be needed. And there is information around what complies or doesn't comply with this, what ID complies or doesn't comply with this law so that you're able to enter these locations. If you don't have a Real ID, there are other documentations that you could use, right? You could use a US passport. So if you are a US citizen, you're able to use your US passport to enter federal buildings or board planes. If you have a US passport, a passport card, you're also able to use that to enter federal buildings or board a plane. You could also use Global Entry, right, or Nexus Entry Fast if you have any of that as a way to use it as your form of ID as you're boarding planes. If you are a lawful permanent resident, right, and you have a lawful permanent resident card or a green card as it's commonly referred in the community, you could also use that instead of a Real ID. You could use a boarding crossing card or a foreign passport or work authorization card, right? So for example, if you are someone who has DACA, right, and you haven't been able to get a Real ID, you would be able to use your work permit, right, your card that you get with your DACA grant as a way to show that as you're boarding planes or traveling, right? I will note that since this went into effect, right, TSA will not accept the IDs or licenses that are not real ID. And if you don't have one, right, and you can't produce one of these other documents, you could still travel, right? But you should be prepared to get further questioning, right? So there will be further screening. They might require you to give your name and your address and other information before they clear you to travel, right? If you don't have this documentation or can produce another type of documentation. Also, when traveling, if you don't have status or temporary status, that's why it's important to think of where you're traveling to and what risks might be associated, because if you choose to use a foreign passport, that has information, right, of where you are, your birth country and whatnot, right? So just thinking about that. And also your work authorization, right, has information and shows that you have a temporary status. So things to think about when we're thinking about traveling, what document we're going to use. Also, I will note that even though this went into effect, people are still, or states are still able to give licenses or IDs that are not compliant with the real ID, right? So here in California, people are able to access an AB60 license, right? If they don't have, even if they don't have status or regardless of their status, right, they're able to access that license. California will still be able to issue those licenses, right? They will just have a note that says federal limits, right? And that goes for anybody, not just someone who might be undocumented. If you decide to not get a real ID, right, you could still get a license, but it will have that federal limits on your license that notes that it cannot be used, right, for these things. And then, so just some things to keep in mind for that. And then also just to identify what type of real ID, or if you have a real ID, right, you will note that for those who have a license or an ID that is a real ID, you will note that you'll have this symbol on the top right corner of your card, right, either a little star or a little bear. If it's not a real ID, it will say federal limits on that card, right? So you will note that it's just a state ID, right, and it doesn't meet the federal requirements of that. Okay, so who is eligible to apply for a real ID? The real ID is a way to show, what type of status someone has, right? Because when you're applying for it, they will ask you for your status, right? If you are a US citizen, you're eligible to apply for a real ID. If you're a green card holder or an LPR, you're able to get a real ID. Also, individuals with temporary statuses, they will be able to also apply for a real ID, but that will be given only for the validity of the status. For example, if you are a DACA recipient, you know that when you go to get your license or your ID, it's given for the time period of your DACA, right? So it's given for the 2 years. And then when you renew your DACA, you're able to renew that. The real ID will be given for that same temporary time, right? It will be the same as the validity of your temporary status. So that's important to note, since you will not be getting it for the full time that the state gives it to someone. To apply for the real ID, you will do it through the Department of Motor Vehicles. They require an appointment here in California, right? They will require information, what your full legal name is, your date of birth. They will require a social security number and then proof of residence in the state, as well as your legal status. And you will need to make an appointment with the DMV to go and show documentation that you are in fact eligible for a real ID before they issue one to you. So let's say that you aren't able to get a real ID, right? Or you're choosing to travel with a passport or with a temporary status. I mentioned in the beginning that we should think through, what are the risks of traveling? Where are you traveling to? Here on this slide, we provided some information on some states that have friendlier immigration policies versus other states who might have less friendly immigration statuses, right? when we're thinking of traveling or flying into an airport or even driving to a certain location. It's just important to note and keep in mind where those points of contact with immigration will be and what type of location you are flying to and what limits that local location has, in order for you to understand what the risks are, right? So for example, here in California, there are broad, sanctuary statutes, policies in place where they limit local law enforcement cooperation with ICE. So as we're thinking of traveling to California, right, maybe there is more protection or safety or safeguards around traveling here in California as someone who might not have status or might have temporary status, right? We also know that here in California, right, if someone has an AB60 license, that cannot be used as a way to identify you as being undocumented, right? So if you're driving and you do have the license here in California, you do have that protection. There are other states here in the United States that also offer either licenses or documentation for individuals regardless of their status, right? So looking at that, and then also thinking about where local law enforcement can cooperate with ICE, right? The ILRC has a state map on immigration enforcement. If you go to the link provided on this slide, you get an idea of what policies are in different states. As you're planning your travel, keep that in mind. And then also thinking about what are the local policies that might increase the risks of traveling there versus decrease the risks of traveling there, and also thinking about what checkpoints might exist within the states as we're thinking of traveling to those locations. And then for travel domestically, right? If someone who has temporary status, and Carolina will talk a bit more about what rights to travel individuals have in different statuses, right? But we're thinking mostly domestic flights, right? So someone who has either a temporary status like DACA, right? Or someone who doesn't have a temporary status who is undocumented when you're thinking of traveling, best to be within the United States, right? Unless you have permission to exit and re-enter the country. But domestic travel generally is anywhere within the 50 United States, and this includes Hawaii and Alaska. This could also include travel to US territories, right, where you don't need a special permit to travel there, like America Samoa or the US Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico, right? For example, there's many more, but these are really common where you don't need permission to travel. If you are traveling somewhere not in the mainland of the United States, right, or to a US territory, to keep your flight domestic, you want to make sure that there are not layovers in other countries, right? So sometimes when you travel to an island, right, there might be a stop somewhere, or if you're traveling to Alaska, there might be a stop somewhere. So making sure that that layover isn't in another country. For example, if you're going to Puerto Rico, right, and there is a layover in the Dominican Republic, then that would not be a domestic flight. You would be somewhere else, right? So either taking a direct flight or making sure that the stop is somewhere within the 50 United States or in another US territory. And then quickly for ground travel, right? So for air travel, right, the real ID is needed. You need to show the real ID or another document that complies with the real ID. For ground travel, you generally do need a photo identification. It's not specified that it has to be your real ID. And this is when you travel between cities on public buses or trains, right? So if you're just traveling within, for example, San Francisco on San Francisco buses, or going from somewhere in the Bay Area, right, or in the LA area, you're usually not required, right? You're not asked for a photo identification. But if you're traveling, let's say from San Francisco down to San Diego, right, on Greyhound might require you to show a photo identification. So keeping that in mind. Also, if you are traveling longer distances, it's important to map out the routes and identify any immigration checkpoints. So here on the slide, we also have a link to Immigrant Rising's travel guide, where they have mapped out what checkpoints exist here in California, right? So if I'm going from Northern California to Southern California, making sure that the bus or the train or even me driving, if there is a checkpoint, right, and I am going to cross that checkpoint, what kind of identification might be needed to show that you are able to do that, right? And then also understanding that within 100 miles of the border, CBP and DHS is allowed to ask you certain questions and inspect your vehicle, right? We've heard of situations where they board buses and ask questions, right? So keep that in mind. And then here it's a map created by the ACLU that kind of shows you where 100 miles from the border is, right? So it's either a land or a sea border, right? So to see where that fits. And here in California, since we are connected to the sea or ocean, right? A lot of it is 100 miles from the border. So just keeping that in mind as we travel. So I will leave it there and I will pass it to Carolina to talk to us about rights.
Thank you so much, Vero. So now we're going to talk about the right to travel. And if we look at it or think about it in terms of a spectrum, where to our left, we have no travel rights, and to the far right, we will have all travel rights. So if we look at it like that as a spectrum, then US citizens would be at the far right. They can come and go as they please. They have the right to travel. They have the right to live abroad for as long as they want and to re-enter back to the US at their leisure without risking their status as US citizens. Then as we go left on the spectrum, so from right to left, we have legal permanent residents who have rights, but not to the extent that US citizens have rights. And we'll talk about it more in a minute. Then if we keep going left of the spectrum, we have folks who might have a type of status that might give them permission to travel abroad if they are granted that permission, but they have less rights than residents. And then all the way to the left, we'll have folks who are undocumented, who don't have status, and we'll also discuss that in a moment. So first, let's talk about legal permanent residents and the rights that they do have when traveling. So LPRs have more rights than folks who travel abroad with permission. LPRs, including conditional legal permanent residents, who are the folks who got a green card, and at the point that their case was adjudicated, they were married for less than 2 years. So they're still residents, but they're conditional legal permanent residents. They have the right to travel within the US and abroad. But if traveling abroad, they don't have as many rights as US citizens when they return. So LPRs can lose their status for a couple of reasons. So for example, if they stay outside of the US for more than 6 months at a given trip, they could lose their status. The government could say that they're abandoning their status, so they can lose their LPR status. And then also, if they have certain criminal history, they might be at risk to losing their LPR status. So residents, if they have any criminal history, particularly if that criminal history occurred after they got their legal permanent resident status, they must speak with an immigration attorney or DOJ accredited representative before traveling, before taking the trip outside of the US. The risk is that if they don't speak to an attorney before, upon their return, they could be placed in removal proceedings where an immigration judge might decide if they should be stripped of their LPR status. So before traveling, if there's been any criminal history, super important to speak with an immigration attorney. Residents must also travel with their unexpired green card, especially if they're traveling abroad. So anytime that they're traveling abroad, have that unexpired green card in order to travel. And then when returning, we got to be very careful because we have heard of instances where border officials have given residents a form I-407, which is a form to abandon their LPR status. So unfortunately, the couple of instances that we've heard, border officials have presented that form as the document for them to voluntarily sign, but are pressuring folks into doing this. So just be mindful that if somebody is a resident when they're returning, we got to make sure that we are on alert. We're reviewing everything. If they give us a form or a document to sign and we do not know what that document is, do not sign it. Ask to speak to an attorney. Especially keep an eye out for Form I-407, which is the form where you would be abandoning your LPR status. All right, so now let's talk about folks who are traveling abroad with a special travel permit. So they have less rights than legal permanent residents. They can only travel outside of the US if they apply for and are granted permission. So here we're talking, for example, of folks with DACA who apply for advance parole, get granted advance parole, and then travel with the advance parole. It could also be folks who have temporary protected status and apply for a travel authorization document. It could also be asylees and refugees who apply to travel. So folks under this category have less rights. They can only travel if they have applied for that permission to travel and if it's been granted. And then they will only be allowed to travel during the period that their travel document is valid, not before, not after. Before applying, the recommendation is to speak with an attorney or DOJ accredited representative to assess an individualized risk. As we know right now, things are changing constantly. There's been a lot of changes. So you want to make sure that before you apply, you have the latest legal advice, the latest onto whether that type of travel is still being approved and what your individualized risks might be. Just because a friend or a relative traveled with that permit, you still need to assess whether that risk is the same for you. And then before traveling, so if the permit gets granted before traveling, again, make sure that you are speaking with an attorney or DOJ accredited representative to assess whether anything has changed. And when we say whether anything has changed, we're talking in terms of the law, but in terms of your unique situations, because if anything has happened since you applied. So for example, if there's been an arrest for any type of criminal history, then we want to once again reassess that unique risk before you travel. We're also hearing reports that some field offices are denying emergency advance parole applications for situations that were previously considered an emergency, but advance parole is still being issued and it's still possible to travel on advance parole now for DACA recipients. So just stay informed, make sure that you're consulting with an attorney or DOJ accredited representative before applying and before traveling. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Mio to talk about dealing with law enforcement at the airport.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you today. So now we're going to be covering how to deal with law enforcement at the airport, but keep in mind that we will mostly be talking about Customs and Border Protection officers. Because of evolving and aggressive immigration enforcement tactics, we are providing general information on law enforcement authority in airports to search you and your belongings. Because it is evolving, we might not be able to answer all your questions. And we're not experts yet on this particular topic. So I just wanted to flag that. However, we're hoping that with this information, you will be better equipped to plan your trips and be prepared for any questions you might be asked by law enforcement, especially CBP officials. So let's begin with some grounding information about who you might encounter at airports. There are an array of law enforcement officials and non-law enforcement officials that you might encounter at the airport. For law enforcement officials, you might encounter Customs and Border Protection, known as CBP officials, who are responsible for enforcing U.S. laws regarding immigration, customs, and agriculture, as well as protecting against terrorism and illegal activities. They usually verify identities and check travel documents. You might also encounter Homeland Security investigations officials, which investigate various crimes, including those related to smuggling, trafficking, and other immigration-related offenses. They usually work with CBP and TSA agents in airports. Additionally, you may encounter other law enforcement officials like the Federal Bureau of Investigations or FBI agents. Their presence at airports is significant because they have dedicated teams focused on aviation security and crime investigation. These special agents and task force officers are assigned as airport liaison agents in each of the country's TSA regulated airports. There might be other law enforcement officials as well, like the federal air marshals and other local law enforcement agencies. For example, at the San Francisco International Airport, there might be officials from the SF Police Department Airport Bureau. Lastly, Transportation Security Administration officers, known as TSAs, are responsible for screening passengers, baggage, and cargo to ensure a safe and secure environment. However, one thing to note is that most TSA officers are not commissioned law enforcement officers, and the role is limited to conducting screening of passengers, baggage, and cargo. But note that even if they're not law enforcement officials, they can work alongside with other of the law enforcement officials I just covered. Now let's move on to an understanding primary inspection and secondary inspection by CBP at airports. When entering the US to a port of authority, like an airport or a border crossing, you'll go through something called primary inspection. For primary inspection, it is the first point of inspection where CBP officers will check the traveler's identity, citizenship, their eligibility to enter the US, any prohibited merchandise or any merchandise subject to duty, and screen for any violations of law that CBP enforces. For secondary inspection, it is a process for when CBP officials from primary inspection refer the traveler to secondary inspection for a more thorough inspection for any of these reasons, like issues with documentation or information, or potential immigration violations, or potential violation of civil or criminal laws, or random screening, or if primary inspection officers believe there needs to be more vetting, or if primary inspection officers are alerted to an issue that may require further investigation. For secondary inspection, it is where CBP officials will ask more questions about the traveler. Sorry. So note that in either primary or secondary inspection, other law enforcement officials that we just talked about could be present. CBP officials and law enforcement officials within DHS have the authority to ask the traveler certain questions. Remember that there might be some other law enforcement officials like FBI agents in the interview, although today we're focusing on CBP officials. However, there are other questions that they may not ask. The questioning can happen either at the border gate or secondary inspection. On the left-hand side, you'll see a number of questions that they may ask. For starters, they can ask for your identification. Second, they can ask about immigration status. Although CBP has authority to ask for your immigration status in order to determine if you have the right to enter the country, you may assert your right to remain silent, especially for those who are traveling internally and do not have legal status. We'll be covering this more in a later slide. Also, they can ask about your trip. But when they're asking about your trip, they can only ask about like the purpose of your trip. They can ask for a copy of your itinerary, the destination that you went, and the duration. And then they can ask also about contraband, like food, fruits, or other items. And if you're carrying more than 10,000, because under the law you have to declare that. And then they can ask about your email, phone number, and address. Although they may ask you about your contact information, this might be a question that you can assert your right to remain silent. Again, we will cover more about this in a later slide. And they can ask about your occupation. But the same is true for work occupation. They might ask this, but you might not want to disclose this. If, for example, you are a journalist and it might subject you to further questioning or search. If you are a student visa holder, you will have to answer your occupation and school. On the right-hand side, you'll see a number of questions that they cannot ask, as it might be impermissibly intrusive and out of the scope of their authority and could potentially violate First Amendment rights to free speech. So what they can't ask would be something like ask about how you planned your trip, ask who helped you plan the trip or who planned actually the trip, ask about your future travel plans or any future plans, ask about who you spent your time with during your trip. Note here for DACA recipients traveling on advance parole, this may be a permissible question because they want to see that the person you went to see is actually the person that you authorize under your advance parole documentation. And They can't ask you about your politics, current events, or religion, again, because that might be an impermissible, intrusive, out of the scope of their authority and potentially violate First Amendment rights. And they cannot ask about your social media accounts. But here you see a red asterisk. Although CBP claims they have a right to ask about social media, this might be a violation of your First Amendment rights. So you may assert your right to remain silent, especially if your social media accounts contain political activism or anything that may implicate your immigration status. And as like a blanket rule, remember, for whatever question you're answering, do not provide false information. Now I'm going to pass it back to Caro.
Thanks, Mio. So let's say that you are being questioned by CBP and the officer gets or tries to get a little too chatty and they start asking you questions that they shouldn't ask you about. So they start asking you some of the questions that Mio mentioned on the prior slide. And how are we going to respond, right? So on this slide, we have some suggested answers that you can give to those questions. You can say that you're happy to answer questions about your current trip and some questions about yourself, but you're not comfortable answering any other questions without a lawyer. You could also simply say that you are asserting your right to remain silent. So simply say, I am asserting my right to remain silent. Remember that there might be some other law enforcement officials at the interview, although for today's purposes, we are focusing on CBP. And just remember also that CBP officials can be very persistent when they're asking you questions. You might say, I am asserting my right to remain silent. And the response to that might be for them to continue asking you more questions in an attempt to get you to answer questions. So just make sure that if you are asserting your right to remain silent, that you verbalize it, right? And it might be that you have to say it more than once because repetition is key and that it's okay. We know that it might feel uncomfortable for you to confront an officer, but it is okay to do so and you can do it. You have your right to remain silent. And just make sure that if you're going to remain silent, remain silent. Don't say anything other than you're asserting your right to remain silent. So now let's talk about how do we decide, how do we assess if we should be answering their impermissible questions? And really, the answer here is that it depends. I know that a lot of us don't like hearing from lawyers that it depends, but really, it just depends. It depends on the person's status and what might happen if they refuse to answer certain questions. So, if we're talking about US citizens, right? So, for US citizens, not answering impermissible questions might result in a travel delay. It might also result in them being subjected to additional sanctions, but they will be allowed to enter into the US. Because they are citizens, they are going to be allowed to enter the US. So for legal permanent residents, they can also decide not to answer certain questions, but this might also result for them in a travel delay, in further questions, and even in officers becoming more aggressive and presenting them a form I-407, which is the form that we talked about, where it is for legal permanent residents to abandon their status. So it could reach up to that, but just remember, we have the right not to sign documents, we have the right to remain silent. For lawful permanent residents, also, CBP officials cannot refuse them entry into the US unless their travel was not brief. They stayed outside of the US for more than 6 months, or if they've engaged in certain illegal activity like a criminal conviction for a controlled substance. If either of these situations pertains to your case, then the advice is consult an immigration attorney prior to the travel because the risk is that upon return, you could be placed in removal proceedings before an immigration judge. So we want to make sure that we assess the risk before traveling. For those with a visa, a refusal to answer questions could result in them being denied entry into the US. For this group, however, if they fear persecution or torture in their country of origin, they should verbalize this because then they would be placed in proceedings to try and seek asylum in the US. For those without status, so folks who are undocumented, they have the right to remain silent, which is what we just discussed. but doing so might lead to further questionings. It could also lead to an arrest or detention. And if they are arrested or detained, and if they fear persecution in their home country or being tortured in their home country, then they should also voice that. They should verbalize that fear. Um, and they should also be prepared to never sign any document that they do not know what it is, because it could be that they might be presented with a document to sign voluntary departure, for example, without speaking to a lawyer, which could lead to different immigration consequences depending on that person's status and how long they've been in the US. So there might be other steps to take, but that is outside of the scope of today's webinar. You can always visit our Know Your Rights website materials on our website, which have additional resources for you to look through. So now let's talk about just a reminder, right? So what are your rights if you refuse to not respond to questions? We all have rights. Once we're in the US, we have rights. So you have the right to remain silent, the right not to sign any documents. If a form is presented to you in a language that you don't understand, even if it's in your language, but you don't know what that form is, do not sign it. You don't have to sign it. You have the right to refuse to sign documents. You also have the right to ask for an attorney. But just know that at the border, because you do have less rights, most likely they're not going to let you speak to an attorney then and there, but you do not have to say much other than I'm asserting my right to remain silent. We do have the red cards on our website. They're free. You can download them. They're in multiple languages. I know that many of us get nervous when we're encounter with an immigration official, with border officials. So if you don't remember your rights, we do recommend that everyone carry a red card, because that's an easy way to remember those rights. I'm sorry, my cat is trying to be in the presentation. So now let's talk about what can CBP officers at the airport search? What authority do they have to search your belongings or to search you specifically, and what they can and cannot do? So they can search your personal belongings for contrabands even without suspicion of wrongdoing. This is why all of our luggage goes through the X-ray machines, because they're allowed to do that. They can search your person either through a body scanner or a pat down. If you're opting for a pat down, you can request that it be done in a private area. You can request to be accompanied by a family member or a friend, somebody who is traveling with you. And you can also request an officer of your gender preference. In very, very limited circumstances, they can do a strip search, but only if they have reasonable suspicion that you are involved in a criminal activity, and it must be done in a private area. They cannot select you for personal search or send you to secondary inspection just based on your religion, your race, your national origin, your gender, your ethnicity, or your political beliefs, or even because you're speaking a different language, right? So we still have certain rights that they need to abide by. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Mio for electronic devices.
All right. Let's talk about our coveted electronic device. So CBP officials claim that they may search all of your electronic devices, regardless of your immigration status or without suspicion that the traveler has committed a crime. CBP has an entire website on this. The link to the website is on the slide. We encourage you all to review it. Our electronic devices contain so much information about us, so we need to be careful of turning them over and or allow CBP officials access to our devices. In today's age, our devices carry intimate information about our lives that could implicate the immigration case of an individual. A CBP directive that is shown on the slide distinguishes between a basic search and an advanced search. According to the directive, a basic search entails an officer reviewing the contents of the device manually. That means scrolling through the phone. An advanced search entails connecting the device to an external equipment to not only gain access, but to review, copy, and or analyze its contents. It requires like literally an external wire to connect your phone to a computer. And according to their own directive, an advanced search requires, quote, reasonable suspicion of activity in violation of the laws enforced or administered by CBP, or in which there is a national security concern, end quote, and it needs supervisor approval. With that said, although CBP officials claim they have a right to search your electronic devices, legal experts in this area disagree, and this is an ongoing legal issue. There's a legal argument that searching our electronic devices should require a judicial warrant, or if there is no warrant, reasonable suspicion that the person has committed an immigration offense for any type of search of your electronic device. Some federal circuit courts have looked into this issue. For example, the Ninth Circuit, which covers California, has stated in a case that at least for a more advanced search of your electronic devices, CBP officials need reasonable suspicion that the device contains digital contraband, which the CBP directive agrees with. Until the Supreme Court says otherwise, for now, you should know that CBP officials claim that they can search your electronic devices. One important detail in the directive that we want to highlight is that it says for privileged information like attorney-client privilege or doctor-patient confidentiality, the officers have to make sure to segregate that information when they search the phone. However, because this segregation might not be digitally possible, individuals might not want to give up their device for it to be searched. We'll talk about this soon in a later slide. And the directive, we also want to point out, says for other sensitive information, such as medical records, work-related information carried by journalists, and business and commercial information, it says that it will be protected in accordance with federal law and CBP policy. And we just want to point out that the statistics by CBP show that there have been an increase in both basic and advanced searches of electronic devices. And those statistics can be found on their website. So when deciding whether or not to give them access to your electronic devices, we hate to say it again, but it depends. The answer will depend on what immigration status the individual has. I know we hate this answer, but it is true. So for US citizens, CBP officials cannot deny them entry, but they may confiscate their electronic devices. For green card holders, CBP officials cannot deny entry and their lawful permanent residency cannot be revoked without a hearing, but their electronic devices could be confiscated. However, note that as we have said before, that CBP officials cannot refuse them entry unless their travel was not brief or they engage in any illegal activity that can make them deportable. If either of these situations pertain to your case, consult an immigration attorney before traveling. And non-citizen visa holders and tourists, CBP officials can deny them entry. If you're denied entry and if you're being persecuted or tortured in your country of origin, tell the officers. This is the same advice that Carolina just explained. And then non-visa holders or undocumented individuals traveling and turning internally, this can lead to further questioning and or an arrest and detention. And the same is true about asserting your fear of being persecuted or tortured in your country of origin. If that is the case, tell the officers. And additionally, undocumented community members should remember to never sign anything like voluntary departure without speaking to a lawyer. And remember that if you decide to refuse to give them access to your electronic devices, CBP officials might confiscate your phone without your consent. If your electronic device is searched or confiscated, ask for a receipt and get as much information as possible about the officer, like the agency the officer works for, the name of the officer, the badge number of the officer's number or email. There are times that an individual might be put on a no-fly or national security list, which prevents an individual from boarding a plane. If you believe you might be on this list erroneously, you can submit an inquiry to DHS through their Traveler Redress Inquiry Program. The inquiry form supports different languages like Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, and Taiwanese. The website will The website we have provided on the link here, you can see on the slide, goes through a step-by-step process on how to do that. In addition to making an inquiry because you believe you're on a no-fly list, you may also do an inquiry if you are denied or delayed airline boarding, denied or delayed entry into and exit from the US at a port of entry or checkpoint. And you can do an inquiry if you're continuously referred to secondary screening. A lot of folks who travel a lot, they use this inquiry program to put in their grievances if they keep sending them to secondary. Also, situations where travelers believe they have faced screening problems at ports of entry. Also, situations where travelers believe that they have been unfairly or incorrectly delayed or denied boarding or identified for additional screening. So that is a good tool if you have any grievances that might happen at the airport. We know that was a lot of information to digest, but if you remember anything, make sure to remember this. In order for all of us to be safe while traveling, we should make a travel preparedness plan. A travel preparedness plan should be tailored to your specific circumstances, but here we have provided a few suggestions. For example, we suggest making a list of necessary documents. Do research of the current immigration enforcement landscape of certain states. We have provided here, and Veronica mentioned this, our national map of local entanglement with ICE. We routinely update this. I think I saw a question in the chat about, is this updated? We try to update as soon as possible as we have more information. But that is a good resource to see what kind of entanglement local officials have with ICE. Also, we recommend have your identification ready, up to date, and review the real ID exceptions. If you don't have one, you can search through that list and see if you can show another form of alternative identification. If you have any type of legal status, make sure you have proof of your legal status and go over digital hygiene tips, which is going to be on the next slide that I'll be covering. And safety planning, have emergency contact information ready. And here we have on the slide an example of a travel preparedness plan that you can tailor for your needs. Now we want to take a moment and talk about digital hygiene. We live in a world where our devices have a lot of information about us, and we want to make sure that we consider a few things before traveling with our devices. Here are some considerations and recommendations to keep in mind. Back up or store your important information from your devices. Travel only with necessary devices. If you really don't need your iPad, your laptop, you can travel with just your phone. And if you're traveling with your phone, make sure to change the settings to from biometric access, meaning fingerprint or face recognition, to a strong passcode, 15 characters or more, because they can maybe get access through your facial recognition or your fingerprint. And with the passcode, you can deny them access through that, and so they can't really force you to give up that passcode. And then remove from your devices any unnecessary photos, especially if you are engaged in political activism routinely and have some sort of like photos that show yourself in political activity that might trigger further questioning. So remove those before you travel. Also consider the usage of a burner phone or a secondary phone while traveling. A burner phone is truly an anonymous phone that has literally nothing about you. No pictures, no contacts, nothing. It might be hard to do this given how much we rely on our phones, so this might not be the best option for you. On the other hand, a secondary phone is a phone that has minimal information about yourself. This is ideal for especially political activists who need their phone for their work. We have provided a link to review the differences between the two. Also, we suggest keep your devices off or on airplane mode, because then that would trigger the passcode instead of facial recognition or fingerprinting. And if you have privileged information, assert that right and let the officers know that you have perhaps a lot of emails between you and your attorney. And now we're going to be covering, and we know that was a lot of information, so we're going to model sort of a situation at an airport so you can see how you can answer some of these questions. So we're going to lay out the scene here, and my colleagues are going to help me sort of play this out. So Maria is a DACA recipient and has advance parole. She's traveling back from the Dominican Republic to the US after visiting her extremely ill grandmother who raised her as a child. Maria has family in the US who are undocumented. Maria participated in various political protests and has some evidence of it on her phone. On the way back to New York, Maria is referred to secondary inspection by CBP officers in primary inspection. She's now being questioned by CBP officers. And my colleague Veronica will be playing the traveler, and me and Carolina will be the CBP officers. So, action. Hello, can you tell me your name and provide me with any documentation of your legal status?
Sure. Maria Ramos and I currently have DACA.
You said DACA? Okay, I need to ask you more questions.
All right, I traveled with Advance Parole.
Can I see your documentation showing you were authorized advance parole to travel?
Yeah, here you go.
Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to step aside from this booth and wait in this room. I'm referring you to secondary inspection. Another officer will join you shortly in the waiting room.
Is there a reason why?
We have the authority to do so. That's all you need to know.
Okay, officer.
Okay, now the traveler is in the waiting room.
Ma'am, my name is Official Scott. I would like to ask you a few more questions.
Okay.
For what purpose did you travel?
Sir, as my documents show, I was granted approval to travel on advance parole because my grandmother has been extremely ill.
And where did you stay?
I stayed at my grandmother's house.
Who did you stay with?
Sir, I'm happy to answer questions about my trip, but not about others.
Okay, fine. Do you have family from the Dominican Republic living in the US?
Sir, I am happy to answer questions about my trip, but nothing else.
Ma'am, you have to answer my questions.
Sir, I am happy to answer questions about my advance parole and my trip, but I do have a right to remain silent on any other questions.
All right, you're just making it harder on yourself. Can I see your phone?
Sure, but I do not consent to a search of my phone. It is turned off.
Can you give me the passcode to your phone?
Sir, I do not consent to a search of my phone. I will not provide you with my passcode.
As you wish, I'm confiscating your phone then.
Is that necessary?
I have authority to do so.
Sir, can I have the agency you work for, your badge number and name? I also would like a receipt for my phone.
Officer Scott, I work for CVP. My badge number is 2365. I'll provide you with a receipt at the end of this, okay?
All right.
A few more questions for you. Have you participated in a political protest in the last year?
Sir, I'm not comfortable answering those questions without a lawyer present.
Why do you need a lawyer?
Can I speak with a lawyer?
No. What are your current political views about any world politics?
Sir, I am not comfortable answering these questions without a lawyer present.
Fine, then wait here. It could be an hour or more. Just sit down.
Okay.
Okay, and now our poor traveler is waiting here for an hour later.
Ma'am, I checked your documents. You're free to go.
Thank you, officer, but can I get a receipt for my phone though?
Sure, here it is.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our amazing actors. And so we hope that that was helpful to see and practice. I think you can also practice with some friends and family as well. And I know we only have 1 minute left, so I'll turn it back to Vero to close this out. We have here provided resources for you. There are a lot of resources here about Real ID, about traveling in airports, about the 100-mile border. We also have, like we said, an emergency plan preparedness. So we encourage you all to review these resources.
Thanks, Mio, and Carolina, and thank you everybody for joining us. Please look at the resources. There's a lot of great resources coming out and being developed or being updated for travel. We know that there are a lot of questions around risk and what your risks are if you travel with different documents or use a foreign passport or don't have DACA or have DACA. Like Mio mentioned, things are changing, interactions at the border are changing, interactions with CBP officers are changing. So it's really important to stay informed of what's happening. And also, if you haven't done so already and you need to, it's important to go and speak to an attorney just to understand how things will impact you individually, right? We went over really general information. And yeah, we have tried to answer as many questions as we can in the chat. Sorry if your question went unanswered, but please do seek out information and seek out a consultation, because that would be the best way to understand how any of this will impact you personally. And then I will turn it over to Cynthia or Alonso to see if there's anything they would like to add before we close.
Yep, of course. Thank you so much to our great attorneys for a great presentation. We are sorry that we can't get to all of the questions. We tried our best, and based off of some of the Q&A, we'll try to collect some resources that may be helpful or have some helpful information for you all. We did link in below the YouTube channel that will have our webinar that's posted, and then the presentations and everything will be sent out shortly. Other than that, thank you all for joining us today. Have a wonderful day. Thank you all.